Hey, folks, you know the story. It's a tale as old as time, really. Somebody realizes they have a voice, an opportunity to share their thoughts with the universe, and as they share their thoughts, they realize that certain thoughts net them a greater social or monetary reward than other thoughts. Slowly, they prioritize those ideas over others, repeating their greatest hits, so to speak, until one day they wake up, look in the mirror, and realize they're no longer authentically sharing themselves with the world. They're just a garden variety grifter named Tim Pool. But hey, at least you get those sweet, sweet Kremlin bucks, right? Anyhow, apparently people like it when I talk about graphs. Here's a graph of my views when I talk about graphs. Let's do that some more. There's been a concerted effort on the American right to represent the American left as the violence party. Sure, Republicans are the ones constantly threatening to use their assault rifles, screaming about civil war, and electing and boosting violent abusers and literal sex predators, but the left points that out sometimes, which makes them the real problem. One method the right-wing uses to paint their opponents as violent is selectively presenting anecdotes. For example, when right-wing nutjob Vance Boelter murdered Melissa Hortman and her husband and injured two others and planned to kill again, conservatives pointed to the fact that Boelter had been routinely reappointed to the Workforce Development Board by Democrat Tim Walz as evidence that he was a secret communist hitman. This decidedly unremarkable fact was blown up to cover for the fact that those who knew Boelter described him as a Trump supporter through and through, who preached against abortion and would have been offended to be called a Democrat. Boelter would later allegedly write a series of deranged ramblings in which he claimed to be a secret U.S. military covert operative who was hired to kill Amy Klobuchar so that governor/mafia boss Tim Walz could become a U.S. senator. For some reason, this portion of the story was uncritically accepted by American conservatives, despite Boelter's version of events making absolutely no sense. Apparently, a Republican Trump supporter killing Democrats because he hates them is a completely unbelievable story, while an off-books secret agent being hired to first assassinate a state representative or two, and then maybe Amy Klobuchar if he gets around to it so that one of the most powerful Democrats in the country can become arguably slightly more powerful, arguably slightly faster than if he had just waited, is instantly credible. This is a pretty common right-wing tactic and one you should pay attention to moving forward. If you ever see someone claiming this violent person was a confirmed leftist, commie, SJW, etc., consider asking what their confirmation was. And when they give you their singular piece of evidence, because it's almost always a singular piece of evidence, consider digging a little bit deeper, especially considering their overrepresentation in political violence stats that they're curiously trying to hide right now. And that's how the game has been played for a while now. Conservatives almost exclusively deal in easily twistable anecdotes over data for the same reason Superman rarely deals in kryptonite. But that's all changed thanks to Frank McCormick, whose terrible fake data we eviscerated last week, and today's Russian stooge Tim Pool, who finally got his Excel certification just in time to make the worst non-PragerU graph that I have ever seen. And yes, I'm including last week's graph when I say that. This is the graph in question, purporting to show violence rates by political party, or number of crimes by party control, or maybe it's number of violent offenses by party affiliation. Honestly, I'm not even sure Tim knows what this graph is supposed to show, so let's break it down real quick. The x-axis of this graph is divided into political parties, except it gives no clarification as to what political party means in this context. Looking at this graph without the included tweet, one would assume that the party affiliation metric here refers to the party affiliation of the perpetrator, so the blue bar would be crimes committed by Democrats, and the red bar would be crimes committed by Republicans. Except we know that's not what Tim is getting at because he refers to the graph as counting crime by party control, meaning that these numbers are counting crimes happening under leadership of a given party. But that presents a new problem because party control could mean a few different things. We can assume he isn't referring to the president's political party since Joe Biden was president for all of 2023, although that would make a baller conservative graph if anyone is interested. 100% of crimes in 2023 happened under Democrat leadership. Please don't ask what we mean by that. So, Tim could be referring to which party is the majority in each state or city, though I imagine he's too lazy to check that. He could be referring to which presidential candidate each state or city voted for in the previous or upcoming election, or He could either be referring to gubernatorial or mayoral leadership, which is a serious distinction that could severely sway the numbers. After all, the mayors of several cities are of different party affiliations than their state's governors. For instance, one could count violent crimes committed in Austin, Texas as Democrat or Republican, depending on whether they counted Governor Greg Abbott or Mayor Kirk Watson as the party leader. For reasons that'll become clear a little bit later, he's definitely not counting on the state level, which leaves the city level as the most likely option in my opinion, which then opens up another problem. Not all cities are Democrat or Republican affiliated. For example, the mayors of Detroit, Honolulu, and Colorado Springs are all registered as independents, but curiously, there's no independent or similar bar on this graph. This confusion right here is already enough to completely disqualify this graph. Tim is so incompetent that he failed to report even who this graph is referring to in a situation where that is desperately important. The information Tim has given us here is already less than worthless, but don't worry, it does get worse, because we haven't even looked at the y-axis yet. Sure, the x-axis is functionally useless, but I'm pretty sure the y-axis was devised by the actual worm in RFK Jr.'s brain. It purports to convey the total violence rate as a sum of cities, which would suggest that I was right in guessing Tim based his x-axis off of the city-level party control, meaning he left off independent or unknown cities for fun, I guess. But do you perhaps notice anything missing from this total violence rate? Yes, I know he never defined what violence means in this context at any point, but I'm looking for something a little bit more fundamental. You know, like units. According to this graph, there were nearly 22,000 violence rates under Democrat control in 2023. Just to illustrate how insanely stupid this is, let's look at one of the most violent states in the US, Alaska, during a violence peak in 2018. That year, the FBI reported 891.7 violent crimes per 100,000 people, which will round up to 900 per 100,000 for simplicity's sake. If violent crimes per 100,000 people were the unit on Tim's sourceless graph, he'd be trying to tell us that Democrats preside over crime rates more than 24 times one of the most violent states in the US during a 20-year high. Alternatively, if you were counting violent crimes per million people, we'd be looking at the opposite, with Democrat violence being a fraction of Alaska's rate. The point here is clear. Without units, rates are fucking worthless. Tim's graph is equally as valid as the joke graphs people posted in his comments, comparing how many bad things my team did compared to how many bad things your team did. As you can no doubt see, your team did more bad things than mine. And this is before asking the basic question, what the fuck does Tim mean by sum of cities? If I were charitable, I would suggest that maybe he added the total number of violences, whatever that means, and then divided by the total population he considered to get an average rate. But given that he clearly doesn't know what rates are, how axes work, and generally what numbers mean, I would not put it past him to have simply added the rates from each city together. In case you don't know why that would be incredibly stupid, imagine there were 3 cars driving on the freeway. One is traveling at 50 miles an hour, another at 80, and another at 100. It's a weird freeway, I don't know. What Tim may have done here is look at these data and report that cars were traveling at 230 miles an hour, because that's the sum of their speeds. This failure could account for the vastly different rates because there are significantly more large Democrat cities than Republican ones. Either way, though, Tim's numbers are bullshit. So I thought about how best to go about correcting the record. I could, for instance, spend a bunch of time poring over the data and trying to come up with a more reasonable interpretation to challenge Tim's graph. But I don't think that'd be quite embarrassing enough given what we're talking about. Remember a couple weeks ago when I said this? Now, I love graphs myself. I like reading them, thinking about them, making them. Hell, a few years back, I'm reading this, but I actually did do this. I tabulated the FBI's violent crime data because they didn't have an effective tool for comparing different states together. That wasn't a joke. I spent hours and hours and hours in 2022 playing around with these numbers, making graphs, doing outside research, etc. And I thought, damn, wouldn't it be embarrassing if I just showed you the work I did back then and it made Tim now look like a total idiot? More than usual, I mean. So that's what I'm about to do. Bear in mind that at the time my numbers ended in 2020, so we will not be covering the specific year Tim had in mind. Given how drastic the difference supposedly is, I don't think that should matter. Plus, Tim's numbers have no source anyway, so why give them the time of day? Everything I'm about to show you is the real work I did at the time. The only change I made for this video is add a date to the capital punishment graphs I'll be showing you, as I feel kind of unethical publicly posting a graph without that basic information on it. All of these data come from the FBI and are based on the FBI's definition of violent crime, which includes homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. The numbers follow the hierarchy rule, meaning that with limited exceptions, only the most significant crime during a single incident is counted, i.e., if a person kills one person during a robbery, this is counted as one violent crime rather than two. The first, and no doubt ugliest image I'll show you is this rudimentary heat map for the year 2020, color-coded according to the key. Note that of the 8 states with more than 500 violent crimes per 100,000 people, 6 had Republican governors in 2020, and 2 had Democrats, those being New Mexico and left-wing stronghold Louisiana. By contrast, of the 5 states with less than 200 crimes per 100,000 people, 3 were run by Democrats and 2 by Republicans, though all 5 went to Harris in 2024, which I recognize is me putting my thumb on the scale a little bit, but it does feel worth pointing out that with limited exceptions, the most violent states are predominantly right-leaning, and the least violent are largely left-leaning. Now, just to preempt a little bit of criticism here, one common argument made about crime rates is that all of the violent crime in red states is happening in blue cities, which is an oversimplification, but not completely unfounded. To that, however, I would point out that there are blue cities in blue states as well, and those, on average, still have lower crime than those in red states. Cities naturally tend to elect Democrats regardless of their state, but their crime is worse in red states, usually. Also, obviously, the more concentrated a population is, the more per capita crime there usually is gonna be. Moving on, here are a few more useful metrics in my opinion. This graph I made shows the violent crime rates over time in states with no stand your ground laws, laws which massively expand citizens' ability to use self-defensive lethal force in public, compared to the national average. I picked this at the time as stand your ground laws are a semi-decent metric for evaluating a state's overall attitude towards crime. Having them tends to correlate with a tough on crime attitude heavily associated with Republicans, and not having them tends to correlate with a somewhat more sociological approach to crime. As you can see, those with no stand your ground laws tend to have lower violent crime than the national average. For some reason, I think because the specific laws vary from state to state, I didn't make the correlating graph, but given the average has to come from somewhere, I hope you can extrapolate what the stand your ground graph might look like. As an aside, Arkansas, the state on this list with the highest violent crime in 2020, passed a stand your ground law the following year. Just an interesting factoid. At this point, you may be noticing a small problem, that being that it's difficult to distinguish between the states on these graphs due to the sheer number of similar colors. If you would like to look at these numbers more closely, feel free to reach out to me on any of my social platforms linked below, or join the Discord where I've posted the Excel document that compiles all of these numbers. Now, to consider another metric, what about capital punishment, another potential indicator of a state's general attitude towards crime? This plot compares violent crime rates of states in 2020 with the death penalty to those without. The two outliers on the no penalty side are Alaska and New Mexico. When adjusting the data to account for the states that have capital punishment but have not used it in 10 years or more, we see that gap slightly widen. In both of the cases I've discussed here, we can see that application of some relevant Republican crime policies correlate with higher crime on average, suggesting that even without considering the governorships or the presidential voting behavior, the Republican approach to crime might not work. While this is by no means a peer-reviewed study, I hope you can see the difference between my approach and Tim's. I, a person who was barely not a teenager at this point, tried to look for useful metrics that actually relate to crime, while Tim, someone 16 years my senior, threw together numbers that made him feel warm and fuzzy inside, while putting no effort into explaining what he was measuring or where he got his numbers from. To put it more succinctly, no, Democrats don't do 20 times as much crime as Republicans. Use your brain. The right does not have a leg to stand on when discussing any of these subjects. All they can do is lie, distort, and manipulate the facts to suit a narrative. But you don't have to do that. you can be not a conservative and not a moron/liar. Thanks for watching. Please do like this video and subscribe to my YouTubing page. It makes me feel all warm and fuzzy like Tim Pool when he declares civil war. Consider joining as a YouTube member and a Patreoner if you so desire. And otherwise, think a little, why don't ya?